May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always pleasing to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So last week, I named the racist history of our state and said that we need to do the work of undoing institutional racism. Well, I saw a great example of what it looks like to do that work this last week. The General Convention of the Episcopal Church is taking place. It happens once every 3 years, and this year it's happening in Louisville, Kentucky. And the Louisville delegation made a public statement. They repented of a part of our racist past. And I was impressed enough by this that I'd like to read to you from the article from the Episcopal News Service. One of the longest-serving presidents in the House of Deputies history, the Reverend James Craik, was a Civil War-era Kentucky priest and slaveholder whose racist views on slavery and African Americans has been disavowed by his diocese for openly promoting white supremacy. Much of the controversy over Craik's views centers on a pamphlet that he wrote in 1862 entitled "Slavery in the South, or What is Our Present Duty to the Slaves?" In it, he described the enslaved as a race of barbarians gradually degraded by many thousand years of ignorance and brutishness to the lowest state of humanity, but now under the care of the most enlightened and civilized race upon the globe. Well, I'm grateful to the Kentucky delegation for their courage. This is not easy to do. It is painful to take ownership of the racist past of our institutions. We are vulnerable when we set out to do this work. In order to dismantle racism, we have to be willing to examine our history and see the ongoing effects in the present. And that means we have to cross boundaries of the accepted, of the status quo. We have to be willing to state that these racist views are not acceptable to us today. And crossing boundaries is risky business. Jesus and the disciples set out for the land of Gennesaret, crossing the Sea of Galilee, and encountered a huge storm. And when they got there, they were confronted by a man possessed by demons, living like a madman in the tombs. And then Jesus heals this madman. You remember the story. It's the story of Legion, and he casts out so many demons from this guy, and they beg him, please don't cast us out, let us go live in the pigs. And so he casts out the demons into the pigs, and the pigs go crazy and run into the sea and drown. Which is fine if you're a Jew and pigs aren't important to you, but if you are the locals who live there and are raising pigs, it's a problem. And so they asked Jesus to leave and go do his version of ministry somewhere else. Crossing boundaries to the margins is dangerous. Last week I argued that Good Samaritan, as an inclusive, traditional, progressive Christian congregation, has become marginalized. Most of the world around us cannot tell the difference between our way of following Jesus and the evangelical or fundamentalist or literalist, anti-science, racist or homophobic voices calling themselves Christian. We want to live in that kingdom where God is love. Where if it isn't about love, it isn't about God. That puts us at the margins of Christianity as commonly portrayed. When we live at our own margin, it's risky for people to come to us. That means that every time someone visits here, there is an element of risk for them. They are vulnerable just stepping through our doors. And people who have been marginalized themselves take a double risk of coming here because we still look like the establishment. Even if we have become a marginal church in this grand scheme of things, the Episcopal Church looks like the establishment that it used to be. And so to come here to this margin is a frightening and risky thing. Crossing boundaries makes us vulnerable to attack for daring to challenge the status quo, vulnerable to rejection for those who don't agree or are threatened by our attempts to effect change. Vulnerability. In all of Jesus' stories of crossing boundaries, of going to the margins, we see people who are vulnerable. The disciples in the boat were afraid because they were vulnerable in that storm. And Jesus responds to the disciples' vulnerability by calming the storm. Those who live at culturally imposed margins are vulnerable. And we are vulnerable as people living at the margin. Those who come to us are vulnerable for the boundary crossing it takes to get here. Today we have the story of Jairus, a leader of the synagogue, who comes to Jesus in great need and profound vulnerability. Jairus comes to Jesus begging him to heal his daughter. He is vulnerable as any loving parent facing the death of their child. And Jesus responds to Jairus' vulnerability by following Jairus to his house. And as they walk towards Jairus' home to heal the daughter, a woman appears. She has been forced to the margins by her illness. She has fallen into poverty in her search for healing. She is vulnerable in so many ways, and yet she has faith that Jesus can heal her. She trusts in God. If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. And she acts on her faith with courage. She pushed through the crowd and touches Jesus' cloak, and indeed she was healed. Jairus, of course, watches all of this from the side as Jesus is blessing the woman, honoring her for her faith, the news arrives that his daughter is dead. Before he can fall into fear, Jesus speaks, "Do not fear, only believe. Have faith. Trust in God." Arriving at the house, Jesus takes the child by the hand and says, "Arise." She got up and began to walk around like any healthy 12-year-old child would. And Jesus told them to feed her. So, how does Jesus respond to the people he encounters at the margins? How does he respond to people who are vulnerable? Well, he drove out the demons from that poor man forced to live in the tombs. He freed him from that possession. He goes with Jairus to heal his daughter. He publicly declares the woman's faith and courage, honoring her and declaring her to be a child of God. Your faith has made you well. He tells the people to feed the child. How can we respond to people at the margins? How do we respond to people who are vulnerable? Well, we can seek to truly know them as human beings. Seek to honor their gifts and their presence with us. Seek to learn from them and to give them a place. This response is all about hospitality. How do we respond as people who are living at a new margin ourselves? Well, we can honor the risk that people take to come here. We can honor them from a place of gratitude and welcome. Humbly seek to see ourselves through their eyes. What a gift it is to learn from others. And again, this is all about hospitality. As we saw last week, traveling to the margins is risky and dangerous. Living at the margins is vulnerable. And we can respond to the vulnerability of others by offering Christian hospitality. And we can address our own vulnerability by trusting in God.